All right. Lunchtime at CodePaLOusa 2019. Thank you again for skipping first lunch to come see and talk about CSS with me. This is Join the CSS Future with CSS Grid. If you're not interested in CSS Grid, I don't know why you're here, but this would be a good opportunity to leave and go see another excellent talk, because we're going to be talking about Grid, and that's about it in here. My name is Bryan Robinson. I'm a founder of a company called Code Contemporary, doing designer and developer education. I say I'm a founder, I'm the only person. I'm just doing designer and developer education online. You can find out more about that at those two links up there. But I've been doing this web design and development thing that we do, right, for about 13 years now. And I've had some of those titles. I've led a design team, led a developer and design team, been a UX strategist, been a front-end developer. I've done copywriting on the web. I've done video editing. Anything that goes on the web, I've touched at some point or another. So I like to think that I've got a breadth of experience on a lot of web things. But in the past 3 or 4 years, I've become, I don't know, obsessed isn't the right word, but it's probably the only word I've got for it, for this idea that layout on the web, design layout, has not been a first-class citizen. It's kind of been an afterthought. It's kind of been hacked. It's kind of changing, though. So 5 or 6 years ago, with the advent of Flexbox, we started getting some first-class tooling for design. Now with Grid, in the past few years, we can actually bake our layouts into our code, which is really, really exciting. And again, I'm very obsessed about this notion, been talking about it for a couple years now. So before we can actually dive into this great and glorious future, right, I do want to dive into the past a little bit, if my clicker will respond. Work with me here. There we go. All right, I'll look at the past, right? So for about 6 years before I formed my company, I was working at a small design development agency in Memphis, mostly doing small to medium-sized, like, marketing websites. So in the course of those 6 years, I oversaw, presented to clients, worked on, did UX strategy for, in the neighborhood of like 300 or 400 homepage designs. A lot of homepages, a lot of different concepts, and about 75 to 80% of those, you'd often see a design pattern that looked like this, right? We're pretty familiar with this, right? It's ubiquitous across the web. We call it a banner. It's got a big background image, a large title font, a little bit of description, some form of call to action on it, right? Usually a button style of some sort. If you're working with a talented team of designers, which I've had the privilege of doing for a little while, you can do a lot of really beautiful things with it. You can be photorealistic, you can be illustrative, you can play with typography, skews, gradients, all sorts of amazing things that clients dig. Clients really like it, and they come back with a lot of great feedback. Say, oh, we really, really like the visual design, we think it's amazing. Oh, but, because there's always a but in client services. But we were talking with our CEO, we were talking with our marketing director, and they really think that we need 4 promotional spaces right at the top of the homepage. We do 4 types of services, we've got 4 widgets for sale, we've got 4 whatever, right? Need 4 promotional spaces. And you go back to the design team, you're a little dejected because they love the visual design. So you start brainstorming, how can we fit 4 promos at the top of this lovely design that we've made? Might have been a great box on the page, but trust me, it was beautiful in real life. You think about it, you say, we like the visual design, the client loves the visual design, let's not mess with that, right? Let's keep the visual design intact. So someone always suggests, well, I guess we could make it a rotator, right? And you always make this face, but you think to yourself, the visual design is untouched, right? And we can do cool stuff with transitions, and it'll be amazing. The visual design is not the issue with making this a rotator, right? The usability is. And there's a website, shouldiuseacarousel.com, which tells us, no, you shouldn't, and gets some UX research into it that literally shows that the first slide in a rotator, right, gets fewer conversions, gets a lower conversion rate than a static banner would. And that slides 3, 4, and 5 get almost no conversion rate. So really what you're doing is you're diluting the power of probably the most convertible section on your website, that first banner on your homepage. So you have to come up with a different solution. Like I said, I've worked with a lot of talented designers. It's been my privilege to do so. We've come up with a few different design patterns, but the one I want to talk about today, yeah, it's super frustrating to use that site. It's just super frustrated. I call this an asymmetric grid. We have a lot of great visual design that can happen with this. We can keep the design pretty much intact. We get to do some visual hierarchy, so we can still lead our user around from, call to action to call to action. And the great thing is, if you already have your visual design set up, this takes like 5 minutes in Photoshop. It's nothing. Like, you drag a few things around, you're done. The problem, of course, my voice cracks, is a problem. The problem is, how are we going to build this?
Was that purposefully Fibonacci?
It is, because it's not exactly Fibonacci. Like, this would have to be smaller, and it is along that line, though, yeah. So how are we going to build this, right? And I'm not going to lie, we can build this in all sorts of CSS dating back 10, 15 years, right? I could have built this 15 years ago in floats. It's even easier in Flex. So let's talk about the problem. The problem with building this in Flex is that we're not actually codifying our layout. We're not thinking about layout anymore. What we have to think about is how are we going to containerize this, right? What HTML containers do I need to make this work? So in Flex, first and foremost, we have to have one big container around the entire thing, right? Then we have to get this 50-50 split to happen, right? That left-hand side versus the right-hand side. So we have a container on the left, a container on the right. That right-hand side has 2 rows. That second row has to have things side by side again. So what this amounts to, if I roll my own HTML and CSS for this, is 3 nested layers of HTML. If you're in a Bootstrap or Foundation world, you're probably at 4 or 5 already, which that's not great semantically. It's not great for accessibility. It's really annoying from a responsive point of view, like having to code this responsively becomes a much bigger pain with all those HTML layers in there. And the code isn't great either. So this is a simplified version. Our promos have become anchors. And we're still at 13 lines of HTML. We have our div class promos, that one big container. We have a left-hand side. We have a right-hand side. Inside that right-hand side, we have a promo at the top and then 2 promos in a container at the bottom. And it doesn't get any better when we look at the CSS. Couldn't even fit the CSS on one slide for this, right? It's 31 lines. There's like 3 or 4 different display flex declarations. There's a lot of little hacks going on with margins. There's a first child margin right that clears the second child's margin right. We have a height of 100% set on the left-hand column to make sure that the background image spans the entire left-hand column. There's a lot of stuff happening. There's like 3 justified contents just over and over again. This works and will make the design happen, but it's not maintainable. It's not overly accessible. It's not easily memorable in the future when you come back to it. It's nested HTML. I want to take this to the future. We want to talk about this in terms of grid. And the first thing that we have to do to start thinking about grid is think about the mind shift it takes. So this is a quote from Rachel Andrew, one of the original advocates for the grid specification, and just an amazing technical author online. She said, if you're working from the content out, when you want your content to size your layout, you still want something along the lines of Flexbox. Flex works great for that. When you have a layout definition and you want to flow your content into it, a grid definition in, then we're going to use grid. So what that means when we look at our promo space, we're no longer going to think about containers. In fact, we're at 1 container at this point. We're going to think about the actual first-class layout of this design. So first and foremost, we have to figure out our definition, our columns and our rows. So if you came from a Bootstrap situation, right, you would look at this and you say, all right, I've got a 12-column grid. I've got 6 columns for the left-hand side, 6 columns for the right. Each of those small promos is 3 columns, right? Sizing it from the content out. If you were trying to make a shift, you might say, well, I don't need 12 columns, right? Maybe I only need 4 columns. I've got 2 on the left, and I've got 2 on the right to accommodate those 2 promos. But the thing that I love about grid is grid doesn't care about the size of your columns. What grid wants to do is actually bake the real layout into your definition. So what we're going to do is we're going to bake our asymmetry, which is a unique perspective on this sort of layout, into the code. So our columns are 3. We have 3 columns. The left-hand side is twice as big as the 2 columns on the right. That gives us the 50-50. It gives us the 25% down there. And we get to define out our rows, which is something that we don't do in web design in the past. So we get to do all this just with the power of grid. And the cool thing about it is I can fit all my code on one slide now. Isn't it, though? It's beautiful. So left-hand side, our HTML, 6 lines. We are under half the HTML required for this layout. And there's 1 container. Semantically great, responsively great, all sorts of things, great. 6 lines of code, beautiful thing. Right-hand side, our CSS code, don't worry, we'll get into an entire slide on it. It is 22 lines of code, 2/3-ish of the code necessary for the Flexbox version. And I think it's more maintainable, it is more flexible, it is easier to understand, and the cool thing is there's no hacks. 0 CSS tricks or hacks in that right-hand side, all using the base values of what grid gives us. So let's go ahead and dive into that code a little bit. Superimposed on it is our actual layout. So first and foremost, we have a div class promos, and we need to change its context from a block level context to a grid context. And so if you're familiar with flex, this is the same thing, right? Display colon flex gets you a flex container. In this case, display colon grid gets you a grid container. But then we're going to define out our columns, and we're going to do that with a property called grid template columns. And this is actually defining out the values we want for each of those columns. The spaces that separate this create new columns. So a 3-column layout has 3 values. I'm using a new unit in CSS. This is a length unit. It's called the FR unit, the fractional space unit. If you're familiar with flex, it is analogous, though not quite the same, as a flex grow and shrink value. You can think of it in similar lines. Again, not technically correct, which I know is the best kind of correct, but it is correct enough for the analogy. But we're not doing anything on the page at this point. Nothing is happening on the page. What we're actually doing is creating the space between what we call grid lines. So when we create 3 columns, what we're actually doing is creating 4 grid lines. And the cool thing about what the browser does, yeah?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Are those relative to each other? So if I've got 2, 1, 1, could I have like 9, 2, 1?
Yes, and actually, usually when I present this, I would have said that's a multiplier, right? So the left-hand side is twice as big as the 2 on the right-hand side. It is a multiplier on the FR unit. Good question for letting me remember two sentences ago that I missed. But yeah, so these lines actually in the browser get line numbers as well. So left-hand side, orange is 1, purple is 2, yellow is 3, and green is 4. They're numbered so we can use them later on, and I'll show that in a second. But we're also going to find out our rows. So 2 rows equals 3 grid lines. In this case, we're using a function in CSS. Who here knew that functions existed in CSS? Cool. So CSS has a whole bunch of different functions. In this case, we're using a new one that is proper to the grid specification. It's called the min-max function. It takes 2 arguments. And I bet you can't guess what they are. I'm not going to let you guess. They are the minimum size and the maximum size. It's a well-named function. So in this case, we can code in a minimum size for our row, which I'm using 30VH, which just makes sure I always have some decent padding in there, and then a maximum size of 1FR. And then the second row takes that same declaration. And what this does is it allows them to grow at the same rate. We will always have a 50-50 split in our rows with this code, even if I add 3 lines of text to that top right promo. The bottom ones will expand at the same rate. Now, you might not want that in your design, but if you wanted 50-50, that would get you there. If you use the keyword auto instead of 1FR, that would give you rows size based on the content. So that first row would grow and the second row would remain the same height. So it all depends on what design context you want to work within. Then, I'm always frustrated with margins in CSS. Margins always do things that I don't expect them to do. And like I said, in the CSS for the Flexbox stuff, I had like 3 sets of hacks just around margins. There's a new property in Grid. It takes care of that for us. It is the grid-gap property, and it only affects internal things. It spaces out the content internal to the grid. It does no external movement. Right? So I never have to clear a right margin. I never have to clear a bottom margin. It's in fact so powerful and so amazing that in new versions, it's coming out as just gap. It is no longer grid gap, and Flexbox is going to get it. You can't use it right now. I don't think any browser supports it for Flex, but they are working on it because it just makes so much sense, right? Like, it's just so nice to be able to do that. So 1 rem is a repeated value. It is our row gap and our column gap. You can also define out asymmetric gaps. For the most part, I find that not all that helpful. You can also define them out as a grid row gap and a grid column gap instead of a shorthand, and you get that. So then, the big mind shift, my favorite thing. We don't just have to let our content flow into this however it wants to. We can explicitly place our content. And in fact, that's what we're going to do here. We're going to go ahead and take our first promo first child. You can use any class you want. In this case, for simplicity, we're going with nth child selectors. And I tell it what column and row lines I want this to flow into. So I'm saying grid column, line 1 is my starting line, / line 2 is my ending line. That gets that first column filled up. Grid row, I want you to span 2 rows, starting at the first line, ending at the third line, right? And that's going to take up both of those row values. I can do the same thing with nth child 2. It's going to span from grid column line 2 to grid column line 4, and then grid row line 1 to 2. So it is spanning 2 columns, 1 row. And then the same for the third and the fourth. But you might be thinking to yourself right now, that's a lot of numbers. And I have to remember and like count lines and all that. I thought Bryan said this was going to be more maintainable, readable, and easier to understand. Yes, It still is, I think, because there's no hacks, right? We're not having to think through CSS hacks, but I get it. Line numbers aren't great. You have to remember them. 6 months down the road, you might forget what you did. But the specification authors gave us some syntactic sugar. So let's take a look at that. Same display grid, columns, row, gap declarations, but a new property, grid template areas. And we can name our grid areas. In fact, you can use emojis in here. I've never done it because I don't really like emojis that much, but you can do it. So what I've done here is it takes a set of quotation delimited strings, right? And each of those sets of quotation marks equals a row. So in this case, we have a 2-row layout, so we have 2 sets of quotation marks. Inside the first, I'm saying, all right, I want the first cell in my grid row to be called main. Space, the second and the third, both called second. End quotation, you could have this all in one line, but readability suffers, so you put it on a separate line. New set of quotation marks. First cell of the second row, be my main area. And this is going to allow that spanning of rows to happen, right? And then third and fourth in those third and fourth positions. And the cool thing is the white space doesn't matter all that much inside of here as long as there's one white space. So you can line things up and make it beautiful in your CSS. And then just like we did before, we're going to place our content. But in this case, instead of placing our row and our column line numbers, we're going to use the grid area CSS property and then use those reserved strings that we just made up in the declaration up above as non-quotation mark strings down here. And we just say grid area main, second, third, and fourth. And the content goes where we told it to with no hacks. It went right where we wanted it to. And the cool thing is, if you like to reduce your line numbers, these lines down here, lines 15 through 20, are 100% unnecessary. And let me tell you why. Grid wants to flow content into the next available grid cell it can fit inside of. So in this case, the third and the fourth items automatically will hit these blocks. So if you care about line length, which you might, we are now under half the CSS to accomplish the same layout as the flexbox mode, right? Now, I personally leave these lines in because 6 months down the road, I am just not going to understand what I was doing with that declaration up above. But if you care about line numbers, half the CSS is a pretty good thing to do. So that's the basic set of the syntax, right? But what actually are we doing with grid? What is grid? It's a cool CSS specification, but it comes with some new terminology that people don't always explain when they're writing blog posts. So as you're learning grid more and more after this presentation, which I highly encourage you to go do, let's talk about the terms you'll see that don't have definitions right away, right? And first and foremost, what we do when we say display grid on an element is we get 2 things for free. First and foremost, we get a grid container. That element becomes a grid container. And then every direct child descendant inside of that is a grid item. Here's your gotcha for the day. If you have a pseudo element, if we had said in our promos example, .promos : after, that will take part in the grid as well. It is a direct child of the grid container. So it's really powerful to start using it like that, but if you don't know that, your pseudo element becomes a grid item, which gets super confusing. Then we have 4 different base units of our grid. Our base units are not columns and rows. They are not, grid template columns or anything like that. We have this idea of grid lines, which I mentioned before. That is the base unit of any grid. When you put 2 adjacent parallel grid lines together, you get 1 grid track. That is 1 row or 1 column generically in our grid. Then if you have 4 adjacent intersecting grid lines, we get this idea of a grid cell. It is the base visual unit of a grid. And then when you put more than one of those together, you get a grid area. Grid area does not mean the same thing as grid template areas, right? Grid template areas makes a grid area, but there's like 4 other ways in CSS Grid that I'm not going to get into now that can make grid areas. Grid area is the generic term. And then the biggest gotcha that you will run into is this new set of terminology, and we call it the explicit grid and the implicit grid. So let's assume with our promos example that our client added 3 more promos to the CMS. We didn't limit the number of promos they could have in our template, and so they added it, but our grid definition didn't account for a 3rd row, right? We didn't go in and add a new template areas or give a value for that 3rd row in our template rows, but the browser understands that the internet is an infinitely long canvas, vertically especially. So anytime new HTML gets added in, it falls into what we call the implicit grid, the grid that we don't define, that the browser gives to us for free. And the cool thing is that new row takes part in the same columns. So we'll still get this little asymmetry down here, right, for free. I didn't have to define that out. It's an auto keyword for the actual height of that. It does not take part in our min-max call, but we get it, it looks pretty good, and the browser gave it to us for free. There are implicit columns as well, but you only run into those if you try to place content outside of your grid. So in our example, we had 4 grid column line numbers, right? If I placed an item at grid column line 8, it would create lines 5, 6, 7, and 8 to place it over there. So those all collapse and it gets a little bit weird. That's kind of a gotcha there. Like if you give a line number, grid's gonna make the lines to equal that line number. So syntax, definitions of new terms. Let's talk about when to use grid. What are the use cases for grid? And the industry as a whole has agreed upon kind of 3 different use cases, right? I mentioned that Rachel Andrew quote from before, right? Content out versus layout in. So when I can take like a Photoshop document, an XD document, a sketch document, whatever your designers are coding in, and actually kind of lay out my lines on their design and figure out where my lines would be, I want to work layout in. I want my content to flow in that layout. Next up, when you want to think 2-dimensionally, right? And what I mean by that is when you want to place and size your content across both vertical and horizontal axes, right? I want to span 3 rows and 2 columns. Grid is what you want for that. And then here's my hot take for the day. You ready? The minute you set a width on a flex item, you have broken the intrinsic value of the flexible box module. Flexibility. So as soon as you set a width, even if it's a percentage-based width, right? Think about using grid instead. Hot take. All right, so 3 use cases that work really well for grid. Let's talk about some use cases that don't. Because grid is not a panacea. Grid does not solve every layout. I have 5 use cases. More use cases for non-grid than use cases for grid. So first and foremost, just to harp on it, because it is Rachel Andrews' quote, and I love her so much, content sizing. When I want my content to size my layout, I want Flexbox. And the best example I've got for that is a navigation, right? Let's say I've got 4 navigational items. 3 of them are 1 word, but that pesky 4th one is 3 words. I don't want to set widths on those, right? Because I don't get like my words stacking in weird ways. What I want to do is allow them to flex however they can to fit on 1 line. Display flex, and I've got that out of the box, right? So content sizing versus layout in. When you want text to wrap, who here hates floats? It's fine. I hate floats too when I'm doing layout. But when I'm doing an image and text wrapping around that image, like 60%, 40%, and then 100% down here, floats are the only way to do that. And floats, that is their intended use. We've been breaking floats for the past 15 years. Now we don't have to, so now we can use it for its 1 use case. If I see you using floats outside this 1 use case, I will find you. Micro moves. When you want to place an element on the page and shift it like 10 pixels, right? You still want positioning for that, right? Positioning, position relative, position absolute, top left, right bottom, just bump it, right? Little bumps. When you want to remove something from the flow of your document, right? Pick it up, have all the content flow underneath it. You're not going to get that with flex or with grid. You're going to get that with position absolute or position fixed, right? So positioning is still very, very important. And then down here, probably can't see it in the back, content flowing between columns. And what I mean by that is I've got a 3-column layout, and I've got text that starts at the top left, flows down, pops up to the middle column, flows down, and pops up to the right column and flows down. Grid doesn't do that. Grid doesn't want your content flowing through it. Flex can kind of do it. Like I could hack Flex to do that, but who wants to hack CSS in this day and age? There's a CSS specification called the CSS multi-column specification. You can say column count 3, and you get 3 columns, and the text flows in them. It's pretty cool. So really, with these 5 use cases for when you shouldn't use grid, layout in the future isn't just grid. It's float still, and flex, and positioning, and multi-column, and grid, right? With all of these specifications working together, we can really create any layout that comes our way. So let's talk about the future a little bit, right? We're talking about taking our CSS to the future with grid. My number 1 thing that I want you to take away when we're talking about grid in the design world is that it's time to let our designers off the leash, right? So whether that means your design team, whether that means the 1 collaborator designer that you've got, or your own internal designer, because I'm a hybrid, right? So I got to do both sides of that. Take off all the constraints we give them. For the past 10 years, especially in the past like 7 years with like Bootstrap and Foundation, we said, all right, you have a 12-column grid. You can't adjust your column size. Please don't adjust the margins. Don't adjust the gutters. You know what? Let me draw some squares. Let me draw some rectangles on the page. You just put your pretty pictures inside those rectangles. As a designer, that's very constraining, but also comforting in some ways. But yeah, let's experiment with new layouts now. Let's work together, pair program with your design team. They may not know that these constraints are gone because we've hammered it into them that these constraints are very important. Because otherwise, it's going to take us days to do a layout instead of the hours it should. What does that look like when we start experimenting with new layouts? This is from the Experimental Layout Lab of Jen Simmons, who Jen Simmons is one of the original authors of the grid specification. She is one of the main advocates for the grid specification and an all-around amazing CSS and design person. But this is an incredibly striking visual design, and there's no images. We get some really amazing visual aspects. She has a grid defined, and then she just turns it with a simple translate in CSS. And then at responsive sizes, definitely look at this on like a computer where you can resize it. The grid snaps into like 5 different configurations, all with like maybe a dozen lines of CSS. Her personal website, which just got redesigned a couple months ago to use grid, all of it's using grid, right? But that's not exciting to me. Like this is fine, like no big deal. But her layout, her logo, is an element on the page with the letters of her name that she then puts on a grid and spaces however she wants to make an interesting logo. So you can also use it for graphic design aspects that are even small on the page. Right? Another example, there's a 6-column newsprint layout, the Daily Prophet, Harry Potter fictional newspaper. The reason I bring this up is because we have a 6-column layout, and then each of the articles is placed on that grid, and then a grid instance is instantiated on that. So each of the articles is also a grid. So you can have grids inside of grids inside of grids. And I also show this because I pulled up the Firefox Grid Inspector tool. If you're learning grid, use Firefox, don't use Chrome, because it gives you, look, the line numbers. It has multiple colors for each grid that you want to display on there. It shows a lot of cool interactions, including like the gaps have shades, all sorts of good stuff, right?
You said the wrong Harry, man.
What's that?
How do you see that in Firefox?
You just open up the inspector tool, and there's 2 ways to do it. You can click on a grid item, you find the display grid, and there's a little button next to it, or you can go into the layout inspector, which in Nightly also has a flexbox inspector, which is super nice too. So if you're doing layout on the web, use the Firefox inspector. But yeah, it's just you click on this little button next to the display grid property. That's the easiest way to find it.
You said Harry Dresden.
I said Harry Dresden?
Yeah.
I love Harry Dresden too, but no, Harry Potter, yeah. I'm a geek. I wrote an article for CSS Tricks a few years ago when Grid was first in browsers called 5 Design Fears to Vanquish with CSS Grid. And one of those design fears is fear of like white space, right? You have a lovely like stripe-based website, and you have nice symmetric vertical white space on each of your stripes, and that's all the white space that we do. But with Grid, it's super easy now. So this layout is about 30 minutes of my time to lay it out like this. If I had done this 5 years ago, I would have been using position absolute, and I would have just broken my computer over my desk. It would have been awful. Could have done it, but I would not recommend it to anyone. So we can do cool things where background images peek out from behind content that's in front of it. Lots of cool things coming, right? CSS Grid is the future. But this talk's kind of a lie. Sorry. This talk's a lie. Grid's the present. Grid has been in browsers for 3 years now, 2.5 maybe, for all browsers. You should be using Grid today. But anytime I say that, people are like, but Bryan, how am I going to support Grid? What am I going to do with the browsers that don't support Grid? And it comes from a fear of this, right? Can I use .com? But look at all that green, right? And if you look up here, this is from May. And we've actually picked up one more percentage point in these percentages up here. 90% globally, now 91%, 92% now in the US of people in browsers that support Grid. And I highly recommend you pull up your own analytics and make sure, because your own analytics are probably going to be better than this, right? So a lot of green. The red is like super old versions, and then a couple like mobile browsers, which I don't really want to talk about. But then there's this puke green over here, and it's puke green because it's in the Internet Explorer column, right? Puke green, Internet Explorer. It's not. It's puke green because it's the prefixed version of Grid. And the reason it's prefixed in Internet Explorer is because Microsoft created the Grid specification. They were the ones that made it. They pushed us into the future, y'all. But when they made it, they made up their own syntax, and then the W3C refined it, and so they are not the same. So you will cause yourself headaches if you want to use the MS prefix for this. So pretend like that's red. Pretend like it's red, I promise you. So if I'm pretending like that's red, that means we have 10% of users to worry about. How am I going to display the same layouts to everyone? We need to ask ourselves a fundamental question for supporting things on the web, and that question is, do websites need to look exactly the same in every browser? .com. There's a website for this. There's a website, and it tells us no. And it tells us no in a way that if you pulled it up in Netscape Navigator, you would still get your answer. It would say no. It wouldn't have a repeating background. It wouldn't have this lovely transparent PNG filigree. It wouldn't have a text shadow. It wouldn't have a fancy font. But it would have an H1 on the page that said no. So if websites don't have to look exactly the same in every browser, .com, what should they do, right? Let's talk about what they need to be. For my money, it's 5 things. They should be functional. When I go to it, it should load. Important, especially in this day and age of single-page applications. Important. It should be navigable. I should be able to click around to different pages if there are more pages. It should be useful. I should find the information I'm looking for. And it should be quick and content equal. And I say those last 2 in the same breath because they're super important. If you think about it, if a user is using IE10, it's because they're on a computer that literally doesn't support Edge or doesn't support a modern version of Chrome. If you're talking about like a Windows 8 laptop, you can't install these new browsers. And you also shouldn't be overloading them with JavaScript polyfills that slow down their performance because their performance is already terrible on the web. So don't slow down, don't bloat your code for these users. They are the most vulnerable among us because they either can't afford or don't know how to upgrade their computers. And also content equal. Don't penalize them. Don't hide content from them just because they're on these machines that can't update. So if we can't use a JavaScript polyfill, I guess we can't use Grid. How are we going to support it? With native CSS, of course, because CSS is amazing now, y'all. It's amazing. So we're going to use something called CSS Feature queries, which is, if you know the word queries in CSS, you're probably thinking, oh, media queries, right? Responsive design. We can do the same thing, but we can test against CSS features in the browser. So before we get into the actual code, let's talk about how we can refactor our Promos example from before, right? I could build this in Flex, but I'd have bloated markup. I'd have a whole lot of CSS to do it, plus my grid. I might as well just use Flex. Or I can think about what this design could be in 8, 9, 10% of users. For my money, it could look like this. My client's happy. It has 4 promos at the top of the page. It's not quite as striking a visual design, but I still get the same navigability, usefulness, content equality, all that good stuff, right? I still get all that, and there's no markup changes. My HTML is exactly the same as my grid HTML, and I can just write 10 lines of Flexbox CSS to get this done. The important part about this is what every browser gets. Every browser is going to start with this support case, and what I like to call this is support first CSS. You've heard of mobile first, right? Where you start with your mobile design and you fall forward into the bigger desktop versions, right? We're going to fall forward into our better browser. So we start with Flexbox, display Flex, gets them side by side. Flex wrap gets them to wrap on the page. We set a width on them, about 50% minus 0.5 rem. That's going to get our middle margin when we use justify content space between. Margin bottom gets our middle margins in there, and then we're done with that. I set a minimum height just to keep some feature parity with our grid, right? And then we're going to fall forward, right, into our grid specification. And of course, a feature query can't be at features because that'd be way too easy. So it's at supports. And then inside parentheses, just like a media query, you're going to have your support condition, right? So in this case, it always takes a property value pair, which is easy for us because we're doing grid, so display grid. If you're doing like a viewport unit and want to test that, you can't just do like 1 VW. You'd have to do width colon 1 VW to test against that. Just a little point on that. And then inside of that, what we're going to do is unset some of the values that we used for the Flexbox version. So first and foremost, the width. We have to reset to 100%. So percentages in CSS traditionally are the percentage of the parent, right? So in this case, on Flex, it would be the percentage of our promos parent. But in grid, percentages are a percentage of the grid area that element falls within. So this would be 50% of any of the areas we've got. We unset our margin from margin bottom 1 rem to margin 0, and we also unset our min height. So the min height, Doesn't necessarily have to be reset because we have this 30 VH here as our minimum row size. But if you want these to be different, you'd have to reset it. Otherwise, it's a minimum height that goes within that element. And then after that, right, everything from here down is exactly the same CSS Grid code that we wrote before. So I have a support fallback. Actually, it's a fall forward, right, that takes, what is that, 1, 5, 7 lines of, or maybe 17 lines of additional CSS and no additional markup. So I don't lose any of the power I gain with Grid, and I gain something for all that 10% of my user base, right? And it's important that we start using it today, because Grid is the future. It really is. It's also the present, and you should be using it today, and I encourage you to go home tonight and work on a Grid, because it's super awesome, and I love it. Because it's super powerful, right? We can do so much with it. It's liberating, because layouts, which usually have taken like 2 days in a development cycle, are like 3 hours for all your layouts, like super quick, super liberating. And then it's creative, right? We can do all of this with our design team and give them a lot of power and make some amazing things. So usually when I give this presentation, I only have like 45 minutes. I've got like an initial 10 minutes. So I want to show you a couple of practical examples too. So while we're going into the future, we can also use this to refactor the past. The first of which is something that came to me like 3 weeks ago. And it blew my freaking mind. I never thought about Grid in this way. So I call this a self-centering stripe, right? It's a pretty regular design pattern. You have a full-width background of some sort and some sort of centered text inside of it, right? A few different ways of accomplishing this in the CSS of old. The kind that I tend to use is we add a little bit of markup to our HTML. We put a stripe content container in there, right, to house that. And then we, should have had some highlights on here. And then we give it a width, and we use the margin auto property, right? Margin left and right auto will center that no matter what size it is, as long as we declare a width of some sort, right? This is the way I normally would have done it. In fact, I discovered this pattern because I was being lazy. I was working on a website. I decided I wanted something to be a self-centered stripe, and I said, I don't want to open up my template. Wait, I have Grid. So no new markup, right? Same class structure. And then I use display grid and grid template columns. Columns. There's an S on the end of that. However, you can use one column. We can make a one-column layout, and I can give it a min-max. My minimum size is auto, allowing it to shrink to whatever size it needs to be, and my maximum size is 1,200 pixels. What this will give us automatically is a left-aligned 1,200 pixel wide box on the page. But if I pair that with the justify content property and I tell it to center itself, then we get this. Using the Firefox Grid Inspector, we have one column, and that shaded area over there on the left-hand side is justified content centering this on the page. No new, based on min-max. So 1,200 pixels, and then as we shrink it down, those margins go away. And then I did have a padding on this. I had a padding on it both ways, and that makes it. Exactly. And to my mind, this isn't quick and dirty. This is actually the better way. This is the way that has zero hacks. The other ways all have little hacks that we've gotten used to in CSS, but really we shouldn't have to use. This is first-class citizen layout. And then the other one that I have time to show you is a card grid, right? You've got articles, you size them down, they go from 4 columns to 3 columns to 2 columns to 1 column, right? We've probably all laid something similar out to this. The flexbox way of doing this would be, all right, display flex, flex wrap wrap, and then I set a width of some sort on each of my items. Width 33% for desktop, 50% for tablet, 100% for mobile, right? Like 5, 3 breakpoints baked in there, right? This is a responsive grid with no breakpoints necessary. So we say display grid, and then we say grid template columns, and we use a new function in CSS, because CSS has functions. It's the repeat function. It can take a value that is any number or a couple keywords. So you can say repeat 3 1FR, and you get a 3-column grid without typing 1FR over and over again. Or you can tell it to automatically fit, create the number of columns necessary for the size of our items. And then we give it a value of that min-max, and we say 320 pixels, so mobile-ish size, and then expand to 1FR. So I'm going to change this to be 300 pixels because I can't do math in my head very well. I'm going to say, all right, we have 4 columns at 1,200 pixels. 1,200 pixels divided by 4 is 300. But if I move it 1 pixel, if I adjust it to 1,199 pixels, Grid will automatically say, all right, we're not at 4 columns anymore. We cannot fit 4 columns. Change it to 3 and have all of them expand out with that fractional space unit to take up the space. Oh, and then when you get down to 900, do the same thing. 600, do the same thing, and so on, right? This is my like ideal this, right? I'm like, oh, you haven't used Grid yet? Check this out, and like it hooks people, right? So I am close. Go ahead.
So does that completely get rid of the need for media queries?
I would say what it does is it gets rid of the need for media queries until you get to a big monitor. Because what you'll get, and at the end of this, you'll see 5 side by side, and it gets to be too much. So at that point, you should have a large monitor breakpoint that you then set a maximum number for. There's actually a new pattern for this using some CH values and some other stuff that a guy named Andy Bell has written, which is it uses like CSS custom properties and all sorts of the cool new stuff happening. I didn't want to overwhelm. This is already kind of overwhelming enough with all those new keywords. So a couple new practical examples of how to do that, but I do want to make sure that you know who to look to when you are researching Grid in the future. First and foremost, Jen Simmons, Rachel Andrew, both people I've mentioned already. They are both original architects of the specification as well as the main advocates that have pushed for it. Mina Markham and Michelle Barker are amazing designers and developers, and they're doing a lot of writing and talking about it. And then additional education, we've got developer.mozilla.com, the Mozilla Developer Network. About half or 3/4 of the Grid content on there is written by Rachel Andrew, so it's a twofer. You get 2 for the price of 1 on that one. CSSGrid.io is a course by Wes Boss. It is free of charge thanks to a hefty contribution from Mozilla. Grid by Example is a Rachel Andrews site where she does color block examples of the various grid properties. JenSimmons.com, she's got all of her video content up there, including her channel called Layoutland, where she talks about even more than just Grid. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, PracticalCSSGrid.com is my course. It's got 7 practical examples of how to use Grid. If you want to go there, I would highly recommend it. It's good content, I like to think. But you can also find out, I've got a lot of blog posts on BryanLRobinson.com that talk about Grid as well as some other stuff. CodeContemporary.com is, of course, where I do my course work. And then at BROB, at BRob, is my Twitter handle. Feel free to ask any questions you've got on there. If you don't like to ask questions in front of people, I totally get that. And like I said at the beginning, if you weren't here at the beginning, I am so glad that you skipped lunch to come see me. There's a lunch session happening right after this. I'm going to go eat. You all can follow me there. We'll get a big table, and we'll talk about CSS Grid even more, or any other CSS topics you want to talk about, because once you get me started, I don't stop. But I will also take any questions you've got. If you do like to ask questions in front of people, feel free now. I think we got, 15 minutes? Wow, I talked fast. Usually it's 10 minutes in my rehearsals. I'm going to go here first, since I talk to you daily about CSS Grid.
So for the larger monitors,
Yeah.
could you embed a grid inside of a grid? And so give yourself some big padding on the left and right for the larger, and then
Yeah.
do that sort of responsive.
At that point, I would maybe just set a max width on your container to do that and still do margin auto or do that weird new thing that I did, and then have the grid inside that. So I wouldn't even use Grid for that outer one. I would just use standard old layout stuff for that. Oh.
Do you have any stickers?
I may have a couple. James mentions because I've got that, but I'm either low or out of that sticker. I do have some Code Contemporary stickers, but yeah. Did you have a question?
Can I see your self-centered Stripe site again?
If you go to BryanLRobinson.com, it's got a whole blog post about it. But there's all the code right there.
So is there an advantage or disadvantage to using supports not versus supports?
Yes. Oh, this is, I sometimes talk about this on that support slides and I sometimes don't. So Internet Explorer 10 and 11 do not support feature queries. Right? But CSS is amazing. So if you put something that a browser doesn't understand in JavaScript, your JavaScript stops executing. You break your entire website. If you put something in CSS that the browser doesn't understand, the browser says, well, I take some offense at that, but I'm just going to ignore it. So everything inside the support query, inside that feature query, is ignored by IE 10 and 11, which is exactly what we want to have happen anyway. But if you say not, then Internet Explorer in 10 and 11 won't be able to read it. So yeah, there's a very good reason not to use not, and it is that, because the browser will take offense at it and just ignore it. Other questions? I love how fault-tolerant CSS is. It's amazing. Really, no questions? I promise, I don't bite. There. Yeah, James.
Do you use Flexbox for anything on any of your sites?
I use it when I don't want to add a width to things. So when I just want my content to size my layout, navigations, occasionally I'll use it for like putting icons next to each other. My navigations are like exclusively Flex for the most part. I do use Grid occasionally for that sort of thing, and then for all of my fallbacks, because for the most part, I only care about IE10 and 11. So I still have simple fallbacks, usually based in Flex, or, and here's kind of the hot take too, what's the matter with just having your mobile design with some nice margins around it for people who don't have browsers that support Grid? I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. It still meets all the requirements of navigable, functional, content equal, quick, and number 5, whatever number 5 was. So there's nothing wrong with that either, I don't think. Yeah?
When you say carousels are bad, you mean carousels that have actions. Just a slideshow is not a bad thing.
Is it a slideshow of images? Does it automatically move, and does it adjust the height of your page on every paint? Carousels for content that you want somebody to actually consume. No, carousels are always bad. Carousels are always bad. So hear me out on that, right? So you have a nice slideshow, right? And a user cycling through it, they're not going to get past the second or third unless they really, really care about it, because users are lazy. If you make a user have to click, that's a problem. If you have it automatically scroll, that's a problem, because then the user's like, I was looking at that, which is actually the point that should I use a carousel.com makes, because it's super hard to use. You're trying to read like this lengthy word list, and it moves, and you're like, ah, crap. You have to go back. So like even like pretty pictures.
Photos of like pictures and places.
So I have on BryanLRobinson.com an example of using Grid where I make an article detail page and I embed a gallery inside of that, and it's an asymmetric grid for the gallery. So you can still display all that stuff and then pop it. So if you give the user an action, right, like pop up a lightbox gallery, and then that is a carousel, they have basically explicitly said to you, yes, I care about this content. And then you can show them more content. So there are use cases for carousels. A photo gallery is by far the best use case for it, but I still would think about other ways of displaying that content, because users are lazy and they just want the content.
Have you ported from something like Bootstrap to this mentality, and like how, like what are the struggles there?
I haven't ported from Bootstrap to this, because when I was working at the agency in Memphis, we had our own custom little grid, right? It was a 960 grid. It was actually 24 columns, blah, 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 right? But the cool thing that I like about this, let me pull that out just so everyone can see it while we talk. The cool thing about Grid is that you can change pieces at a time. So let's say you have a new layout that you want to insert into one of those rectangles you gave your designers, right? Like, all right, we're still in Bootstrap. Let's not completely refactor our entire website, but let's start thinking about how we can do these boxes better. So we have a box that is X type of promo, right? Design team, come up with something crazy. Like, let's do something nuts. And then design that block with new custom CSS for just that block. And then you can start replacing pieces. I'd say if your website is fully Bootstrap or fully Foundation, do what gets the product out. Always do what gets the product out. But as you start moving in this way, the ideal would be you learn enough so that the next version of your website or the next agency site you put together or the next whatever you're doing, right, doesn't have to rely on Bootstrap. Now, Bootstrap still gives you stuff out of the box, right? It gives you design out of the box. But if you're working in a custom design world, it means that you can do it much easier and you don't work within the constraints and the bloat that Bootstrap brings. Other questions? Yeah.
So my 2 biggest clients are, as an enterprise, on IE11. So what you just described sounds like one way that we can maybe start to think about it in some areas. But in your experience, is it worth like building out full layouts and Flex and then overriding them, or does that create more complications?
So you have 2 big clients, and they're like they're viewing.
Organizations themselves, like internally, are all IE11. So we're going to have the expectation that.
Yeah. Do they have clients external, or is it all internal apps for them?
No, it's external.
So 100%, yes, I would do simple Flexbox stuff, and I would have that conversation. Internally, you're going to see a nice-looking design that isn't the cool layout that our designers just made. Externally, you're going to have something truly amazing, world-class, and unique on the web because we're utilizing these new things. So that is the difficulty, right? Like always, so if you're in client services, know what your clients are looking at your website on. Because my advice is usually, most clients won't recognize that you changed the way you're doing it. Because most clients are on more modern browsers. But if you're in an enterprise world, you may be dealing with that. And at that point, have that conversation. Like, we want to support the small percentage of your users that are still using this, but keep in mind, we want to do something new, better, and make you world-class, make you unique on the web, because no one's doing some of these asymmetric stuff. No one's utilizing this stuff yet. You can make your client sites something that are just beyond any of their competitors, but only if they don't care what it looks like on their computers. And still, like, have it look good and decent, right? But then have something bigger on top of it. And do it in as little code as possible to support that old stuff, whether that's mobile view with margins or whether that is something that is an actual flex fallback to some middle ground there. I think there's a question over here.
Yeah, you get a lot of accessibility like baked in with Bootstrap like,
Yes.
out of the box. So,
Theoretically.
Yeah, theoretically, right. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that. Like, how do you address that?
I will preface this with I'm not nearly the accessibility expert I wish I were. But it's the same thing. There was hot drama, because I love Twitter hot drama, about Twitter's redesign, right? Which, as we know, Twitter made Bootstrap. But they're all in on like React Native and all these things that are just like, their whole thing was this div button that we have is more accessible than an HTML button, right? And theoretically, in the theoretical realm, yes, it probably is. But the browser gives us so much built-in stuff that we would be rewriting all these pieces of functionality in that. So in Bootstrap, you do get a lot of that, and I highly recommend reading through all the Bootstrap stuff that's happening. But some of it's also unnecessary accessibility that's in there too. They've got like ARIA roles on like everything, and not all of it is necessary. And some of it is because they used divs when they should have used an accessible HTML element. So nothing is going to beat knowing accessibility firsthand and using the proper semantic HTML. And when you break the accessibility of those pieces, using ARIA. ARIA is fully intended for when you're outside of the accessibility of natural HTML. But all that being said, you can break Bootstrap's accessibility super easy too, by structuring your content improperly or by using too many of those roles. Like on an image source, there's actually, and again, not an expert, and I wish I were, there's a way that you can actually use like alt tags on images and be less accessible than if you just not had an alt tag or had a blank alt tag. Like if it's a decorative piece and you have an image tag for it, it's sometimes better just to leave that blank because you're getting in the way of the accessible content the user actually wants. So all that to be said, you get a whole lot of stuff baked into Bootstrap, and that's good, but it's also important to not make the same website that everyone else makes too. So it's a give and take, and again, momentum in your production is oftentimes more important than implementing something new and better, but little pieces, little pieces. Yeah, James.
For someone that might be interested in getting a review tomorrow, could they come specifically to ask for a CSS review from you?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, like if you don't want me to critique your designs, which I'm very gentle about critiquing designs, I can also like take a look at CSS and be like, oh, here's how you can refactor some of these pieces to be more resilient, or here's why this percentage value probably doesn't make sense, or any number of things where I gently lead you down the path of this future CSS world that we're going into. Other questions? That's what I got for y'all, and I'm sorry that like I'm 7 minutes early, but that also means you get to eat a little earlier, so you're welcome on that. Thanks, y'all.